Hey everybody, Tall Family Films here. Today we are replacing ball joints on a 2011 Hyundai Elantra. So this is the ball joint right here. We'll get a good close-up on this so you can see just how bad it is. So that boot's pretty much completely disintegrated. You probably hear noises when you turn and anytime, that, especially if you're going over a bump and turning at the same time. So you'll want to turn the wheel out, turn to the left, so if it's on the driver's side, so that we can get the brake caliper off. We do not want to pull off just the brake pads. We want the entire bracket and everything that holds the caliper. So it's a larger bolt. You can see it right down in here. We're not taking off those top bolts that I pointed at earlier. All right, so removing both of these bolts. These two bolts are the only thing that holds the brake caliper onto the rotor. You can see the whole thing shifts there. So now we want to attach the caliper to something that will hang it. We don't want it to just hang from the brake line, so I'm just attaching it to the coil spring using a bungee cord. And now it's out of the way. So I turn the wheel back straight and I need to take off the axle nut now. So the axle nut is, it's put on and then there's a space on the bolt for the axle nut, it's on the actual axle, that has an indentation in it. And you bend the axle nut down so that it won't come back off. So you're physically bending part of the nut into that indentation. So I've straightened it back out and now I'm going to use an impact wrench to get that axle nut off. Okay, so I was using an impact wrench, as you saw, but if you needed to use a breaker bar, you would run into a different problem, and you'd need to do things in a slightly different order. So if you don't have an impact, you're going to put a breaker bar on the axle nut. Don't take the caliper off first. What you're going to need to do is take a screwdriver and put it down inside the brake rotor. You see these little holes that go all the way around the brake rotor. You just slide it in there, and then when you go to pull the axle nut to come loose, it's going to hit the caliper, and the screwdriver is going to hit the caliper, and it won't let the wheel continue to turn. All right, so you'll need a very large Phillips head screwdriver. You might need an impact driver. I was able to get this side off without using an impact driver, just used a really large screwdriver. There's two screws that hold the rotor on. Remove those, and the rotor should come right off. This particular rotor had been on for quite a while. This car had been used up north. It's been in the south for quite some time, so the rust isn't terrible on it. And but the rotor still was stuck just a little bit. Took me a little bit of tap with a hammer in order to get it to come loose, as you'll see. Give it a little tap. There we go. So the rotor's off, and now we can get to work. On some similar jobs, people will put the nut back on the axle and then tap it to drive it back through, just to loosen it up. We do not need to remove the axle to do this job, so we're not going to do that. But to get to the ball joint down here, I am going to need to remove a couple of things. So I'm going to remove the sway bar end link over here. As you can see, you'll get a better view of that in just a second. And then also the tie rod end that controls the steering. I don't think you actually need to remove the tie rod, just so you know, but I was also doing the wheel bearing in this, so I did have to do it for this job that you're going to see. If you do remove the tie rod end link, you're going to see it's very easy to do. It's nice because it allows you to control the steering of this one side of the car literally by just moving it with your hands. Okay, so now let's move over and take a look at the tie rod end. So this is the piece that controls the steering when you turn the wheel. There is a joint right here that is flexing, allowing you to actually physically turn the wheel. So this is called a castle nut, and it's a special nut that looks kind of like the crown of of a king, and they have driven a cotter pin through the bolt. So there is a hole in the end of the bolt, and they just drive this cotter pin through, which is just a small little piece of metal, and then they bend it over. And that keeps that nut from ever coming out. This controls your steering, so clearly you don't want it coming out when you don't expect it to. All right, so after that, the nut just comes off like a normal nut. And just to make it simple, I'm going to use the impact wrench for this as well. Okay, so then you'll want to turn the wheel all the way out. This is, again, if you want to remove the tie rod end link. And there's lots of ways to do this. I'm using an actual ball joint separator. You can get this as a rental from AutoZone, so it doesn't cost you anything in the end, if you bring it back to them anyways. And it just makes this actual job of separating the ball joints easy. Now, there are certainly ways to do this with like a crowbar and a hammer, and there's other methods. But since the tool's free, I thought I'd show you how to use it. The tool is pretty simple. It has a bolt in the back that as we tighten it down, it puts pressure on the bolt that's attached to the tie rod. Okay, so we want to make sure that the forked end of it goes where the boot is. Don't mess up the boot doing this. You shouldn't have any trouble getting it. There should be space for you to get it in there. And then as you tighten it, as you see I'm tightening the bolt, it's putting pressure on the tie rod end link bolt. And then all I have to do is tighten it down, and eventually it will pop the ball joint apart. It's a pretty cool tool. That's it. Okay, so now we're going to remove the nut that is sitting on top of the ball joint itself. So I'm going to speed this up because this takes a little while. There's not an easy way to get in here. There's not a tool that you can use. There's no ratcheting head that will fit in here, so this is just kind of painful. So I quickly learned that the tie rod end needed to be attached very loosely so that the knuckle will stop turning when I'm turning this nut. So I just stuck the tie rod end back in and very loosely put the castle nut on. I applied a little lubricant to the ball joint post, and that let this nut slide off a little bit easier. If the entire post spins on you, then take a pair of needle nose pliers, needle nose vice grips, and grip the threads below the nut. Hopefully you can get that far. If not, you're going to have to just tear that boot apart and find a way to get in there to hold it steady. But luckily that did not happen on either side for me. So I'm going to use the same tool here, this ball joint remover, or ball joint separator, to separate this ball joint as well. We'll back up here and get you a little bit better view of how this sets in. Okay, that should do it. Okay, so this one's a little bit easier to get to with a socket. So we're going to use a ratchet and a socket to tighten it down. Okay, there is a lot of tension building on that right now. This ratchet has an extended handle on it. There's so much tension that it actually feels a little bit scary. So instead of continuing to turn it, I'm just going to tap the bottom of the control arm. I'm not hitting the tool, I'm not hitting the knuckle, I'm hitting the control arm. There you go. There you go. And now you can separate the control arm from the knuckle. We have access to the ball joint, finally. So next you're going to need a ball joint press kit. And you can get these at Harbor Freight. You can get them at AutoZone, where I got these. Notice these numbers that are on these cases. Those are the numbers that AutoZone would identify them by. And at Harbor Freight, this whole kit I think is like $150, and it would include both of these things. But this press kit is very stout. So I've used the same kit for doing trucks that were a lot harder to get the ball joints out on. It did just fine. So use a brake cleaner here just to clean things up a little bit, because there is a clamp that holds the ball joint in, and we have to get that clamp out. So the brake cleaner just kind of gets some of that grit out of the way that may hold the clamp in place. So the flathead screwdriver I'm using right now just to try to loosen the clamp, because it's kind of stuck in place after all these years. So now that I've gotten it to move, I should be able to pop the clamp up. Your new ball joint will come with a new clamp. This particular clamp did not have it didn't have holes in the ends of the clamp like you would have for snap ring pliers. So this is a little bit harder to get out. I'm going to pry it out with a flathead screwdriver, as you'll see here. All right, so unfortunately, the clamp is not the only thing holding the ball joint into the control arm. There is also a lot of tension that holds it in. So that's what the ball joint press kit is for. But we can't use the press kit until the clamp is out of the way. Okay, so clamps off. That is trash. So now we're going to take some different pieces. These are pieces from the two kits together to make this work. So I needed both kits in order to have all the parts that I needed. So I'm going to use the press itself to force the ball joint down. I didn't have anything in the kit that would actually fit well around the ball joint, but the press itself worked really well. So then I put a cup underneath it to hold the ball joint. Like when I start to press it down from the top, it's going to want to go through the bottom, and I need something there to catch the ball joint. Leave room for the pressure to be built around it, but let it fall all the way through. So this cup does a really good job of that. So I used a lot of various tools to do this. To tighten this, started off with a normal wrench, large wrench, fixed wrench, and then I put two wrenches together, and then eventually I had to switch over to a ratchet because the tension was just too hard. I couldn't pull it anymore. If some cars you can do this from the top, and if I could have switched it around, then I might have been able to get an impact wrench on it. But there we go. So the ball joint is out. The really hard part of this job is now done. You can see just how terrible this ball joint is, especially when you see the new one. Speaking of the new one, I had a really hard time finding them. Take a note of this part number, the company. I got that from O'Reilly. I looked everywhere. Everyone wanted to sell the control arm with the ball joint. You can do that. You can replace the whole control arm, and then you don't need this ball joint press or anything like that. It does make the job easier if you can get the control arm out. But the ball joint is a lot cheaper. So this was an economy job we were doing. So I think I paid about $35 for the ball joints, and renting all the tools is free. So in my time, well, it's worth nothing. So it didn't hurt us at all. So you just saw me clean the hole out, and with some brake cleaner, add a little bit of grease, take our new ball joint, and we need to find now kind of a cup that goes in a different direction, because now we need to force it in. So this cup fit really well around the ball joint. I don't want to press right onto the ball joint, so that's why I want this cup that goes around the ball joint. So I'm using this little cup, and I'm going to kind of do the reverse of what I did before to press it back into place. And then using trial and error, just figuring out which cup and combination is going to work well to do this. It's kind of obvious when you're doing it. That's a good thing, because I give you terrible camera angle here to see what I'm doing. But So sorry about that. But like I said, you'll know when you're pushing it back through, there has to be room for the ball joint to actually come through without interacting and hitting the ball joint press. And this combination worked pretty well. And it's in. So the new kit will come with a snap ring, and you just attach the snap. In this particular kit, the new snap ring has holes in it for snap ring pliers. So that's what I'm using here, some proper pliers and that's pretty much the whole job. So if this video has helped you, you can really help others by giving it a thumbs up, and you can help me by subscribing to my channel. Thanks a lot.